troubled times, and India, as you know much better than me, as an ancient civilization, as a superpower in its own right, finds itself centre stage in all the challenges we face, from pandemic, climate change, matters before the Security Council which you sit on, including the threat of nuclear military action and what we're seeing in the Ukraine. But before we sort of come to those geopolitical matters, I just want to begin by acknowledging the enormous and the generous contribution India has and continues to make to the development, the manufacture and the distribution of the vaccines that are slowly but surely helping the world emerge from the COVID nightmare. Dhanyavad, or as we say here, namahi. Tell us, if you will, Minister, about India's huge effort in this regard and what it has meant for you in your position as External Affairs Minister.
Well, first of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be here. This is my first visit to New Zealand. It's my first visit as a minister, which is my first visit even otherwise. It's something which, quite honestly, I wanted to do for some time. Obviously, travel's been difficult the last few years. So for me, this visit is very much part of validating how normal life has now become after COVID. I'm so glad you mentioned our 2019 meeting. I remember that too quite vividly. I'd barely been at the minister for about 2 months at that point in time. I think my recollection is of a very open discussion we had at that time on the Indo-Pacific. Now, the last time we met in 2019, there were changes already happening in the world. There were changes of a very fundamental nature, the rise of China, the rise of India, which followed thereafter, the changes in the American positioning in the world. Some of that were really trends that I had tried to capture in my book, I got out a few months later. Now, since 2019, we've actually had, I would say, multiple stress tests, each one of them of a very serious, in some ways almost unprecedented nature, beginning with the COVID. When you speak of a once-in-a-century phenomenon, I mean, this is literally once in a century. On top of that, we are now looking at the consequences globally of the Ukraine conflict, and mind you, there are other conflicts as well. I mean, there have been big changes in Afghanistan, and those have resonated beyond the region. And we are increasingly seeing climate change not as a threat which is impending, which is something which we worried about would hit our grandchildren, but as something which happened last week, last month, last quarter. And together, each one of them in themselves, but coming one on top of each other, I think has put the world under really extremely difficult circumstances. It's very important, I think, today to recognize that and understand that there are a lot of countries who are looking at the near-term future and deeply worrying about their ability to get fuel or food or fertilizer or finances for their people. So it is a difficult moment. And when times are difficult, it is equally important that those who have some capability to be a part of a solution step forward, do what they can. Each one of us may not be able to change the world by ourselves, but by working together, I would say we will kind of multiply our capabilities. And a good example you raised was during the COVID. We were one of the biggest manufacturers of vaccines. We still are. Even as we were vaccinating our own people, we took a very conscious decision that we would help others. And we prioritized countries who we felt would not have a fair access to vaccines globally. So I think in this region, we gave vaccines, my memory is to Fiji, to Solomon Islands, and I think to Nauru, if I'm right. And we actually gave a lot of COVID-related medicines, hydroxychloroquine, even PPEs and ventilators to a number of other Pacific islands. So that's part of how we view the world today, which is that it's, we need a kind of a, what I would say, a collaborative neighborhood watch approach to the region, to the Indo-Pacific, where those who are comfortable with each other are prepared to work for the betterment of the region, and that's one message that I bring to New Zealand.
Once again, Dhanyavad. And Minister, we stick with that global affairs theme. I'd be really interested, and I know the audience would be, in how India today conceives of its place in the world and positions itself. I know you have said in the past, you fundamentally, as I understand it, reject the kind of binary view of two axes, US-led one, the West if you like, and a China-led one of the rivals. So I'd also be interested, just getting a sense from you, China, the US, even if we say that that binary view is somewhat misleading, nevertheless there is superpower competition. How does India place itself amongst all of those swirling issues?
I would agree with you. I think the binary view is outdated. And in fact, quite honestly, in defense of the United States, I don't think they uphold a binary view anymore. In fact, one of the changes that we have seen in the last few years is the US itself much more open to working with countries outside the traditional alliance or treaty relationships. So you have a mechanism like the Quad, which involves some traditional allies for the US, but also a country like India, which has historically stayed away from alliances and treaties. And my sense of why we should really put the binary framework to rest is if you look today at the distribution of power, if you look at which are the major economies of the world, economies large enough really to have an impact on global decision making. I would argue that there's been a much flatter distribution of power in the last maybe 30, 40 years. One example of that is if you remember, let us say the 1970s and 80s, where pretty much the big global decisions were made by the G7. Today, that kind of centrality or that kind of role has shifted to the G20, which is a much broader grouping of powers. When I think even the G20 by itself does not capture anymore either the complexities or the solutions of the world. You have many more regional powers who influence what is happening in their immediate environment. So the world is, whether we like it or not, moving towards more players, more issues, more autonomy in a way, if you would. To my mind, therefore, requiring more consultation, more collaboration. And there isn't a sort of a formal fix that we can have for this. I think we need a set of solutions. Some of them, perhaps like the reform of the United Nations, and some much more ad hoc, much more flexible. I refer to Quad, but I think you have, for example, now a new proposal called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So you will get, there is a churn in the world, and the churn will throw up new ideas, new proposals. Some will work, some will not. and that's how it goes. Now, your question, where does India see itself? Well, we are today the fifth largest economy in nominal terms. Our expectation by the end of the decade is that we'll be the third. We will probably, in the next few years, be the largest, most populated country in the world. I think if you look in terms of our capabilities and our, I would say, contributions to the big issues, the big challenges of the world, climate change, pandemics, counter-terrorism, I think we will weigh in much more. And what I suspect we will bring to bear is actually the experiences of what is a civilization state. That a polity which in some form or the other has existed over 5,000 years. And there is a lot, 5,000 years is a reasonable learning curve. There's a lot that you have sort of picked up over this period, and I think you can, we would like to bring that to bear. And I want to drive home this point that, the India which is, growing in size, which is becoming more capable, more prosperous, it's also a much more international India. When I look at, my younger colleagues today, even within my own family, my nieces and nephews, I mean, their sense of the world is so different and so much more knowledgeable and involved than it would have been mine 40, 50 years ago when I was their age.
You're presenting a picture of a confident India.
Yes, indeed, and also a connected India. I see events in the world which Indians respond to. It's not like, we are doing well and this is our space and, you sort of limit yourself to it. I think, I mean, if I can be a little undiplomatic here, in a lot of countries, foreign policy, foreign, development assistance, foreign involvement, sending your people out are not popular. In my country it is. I enjoy the benefits of it as a foreign minister. That the public actually supports a greater foreign policy presence, footprint and involvement. My budget is actually growing.
That's good to hear. Maybe that means more trips to New Zealand, Minister. And of course, this room is testament to your very point, the Indian diaspora all around the world. I want to pick up on a number of the things you've talked about, the UN Security Council, the Quad, what's happening in the Pacific. We can just touch on, though, something else you mentioned, the Ukraine. You've explained on, I think, many occasions why India has chosen to abstain on all the substantive resolutions on Ukraine at the Security Council. And at the same time, your country has consistently called for peace and dialogue. You pointed out that India is in a position to say things that other countries perhaps can't about the war in the Ukraine. I'm just interested, Minister, getting a sense from you, do you feel that India is being listened to by both sides? And if I can be diplomatic, by Putin himself in particular?
When it comes to Ukraine, it's natural that different countries, different regions would react a little differently. People would view it from the viewpoint of their immediate interests, their historical experiences, their insecurities. To me, the diversity of the world, which is quite evident, would also naturally lead to a differential response. And I would not disrespect the position of other countries, because I can see many of them are coming at it from their threat perception or their anxieties or, as I said, their equities in Ukraine. as a foreign minister, I have to ask myself this question. In this situation, what is it that India can do, which obviously would be in Indian interest, but which is also the best interest of the world? Now, at a sort of a macro level, the ideal answer would be, well, go fix the problem and facilitate a peace settlement. Now, we all know that that is probably incredibly hard, to use an understated term. So, at this time, I think the sensible thing to do is to see if you can temper it down. If there are specific parts of the complex situation that you can address and try to help out. So you don't try and do everything and do necessarily the biggest thing. You take the doable bits and see if you can devote energy to that. And in our own way, we have tried to do that. So some months ago, when there was this initiative to get the grain out through the Black Sea, we were, some of the countries and the UN, which was leading the effort, were interested in our weighing in with the Russians, which is what we did at that time. Now, it's anybody's guess how much of a difference we made. I have my own reasons to think, to know that somewhere our speaking to them had some impact, because they did come back to us on some aspects of that conversation. When I was in the United Nations a few days ago, the big concern at that time was the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant there, because there was some fighting going on very proximate to it. And again, there was a request to us to press the Russians on that issue, which we did. There have been some other concerns which, at various points of time, either different countries have raised with us or the UN has raised with us. I think at this time, whatever we can do, we would be willing to do. Your issue, does this have an impact on others? At this moment, I would say the conflict is still hot, passions are still high. It's not easy for people to, shall I say, readily listen to voices of reason. But I would say, with some degree of objectivity here, that if we take up a position, if we voice our views, I don't think countries would disregard them. And I think some of that you could see was reflected in the meeting which my Prime Minister had with President Putin, and what was said by the two of them before the Prime Minister.
Thank you. Let me ask you two questions, really, just to follow on from that and broaden it somewhat. Firstly, do you envisage, and I take your point about the nuances of different governments and countries, nation states' positions, do you envisage a situation where India could take a different stance than its relatively, if I can say it this way, even-handed approach on the Ukraine war? And secondly, you've mentioned really the threat of nuclear weapons. I think everywhere in the world is very mindful of this right now, certainly in relation to the Ukraine. It's deeply worrying. We've seen North Korea this week fire a ballistic missile over Japan. I was in my homework very interested, Minister, to see that your PhD is in fact in these issues, or on these issues of nuclear disarmament and armament and diplomacy. Yeah, give us, you'll be well aware of New Zealand's position. Give us a sense of how you see that. I suppose, if I can put it this bluntly, should we be worried?
Well, anything nuclear, I would always worry, because it's nuclear. But and therefore it's very important to address, whether it's nuclear trade or nuclear technology or nuclear facilities or nuclear weapons, with the utmost sense of responsibility. But the first part of your question, I still think, eventually, look, this conflict will require countries to come back to the conference table. It's not a conflict which is likely to be settled on the battlefield. So, if they are going to come back one day, it's in our collective interest that that day is sooner rather than later. And anybody who can facilitate that, encourage that, smoothen that, I think is doing a service. So, this, it's not a question just about being even-handed. I regard it as much more, here's a conflict, where do you see it going? What's a possible end game? And how do you get to, facilitate at least the ability for the participants in the conflict to sit down and talk. I think more than an even-handed, I really think it's a kind of a constructive way towards an end game, rather than intensifying a kind of middle game.
Let's change tack just slightly and talk global governance. As I'm sure you know, New Zealand has been a consistent supporter of India becoming a permanent member of the UN, or a reformed, I should say, UN Security Council. And as a small country, we've always put a premium on a multilateral rules-based system. You emphasise, I'm interested in multipolarity, and I'd be really interested in your assessment of the current state of play of our global institutions, and just what you mean by a multipolar world.
Well, by a multipolar world, I go back to the landscape that I described in the first set of remarks, which is a widespread distribution of power, acceptance that the big problems of the day cannot be solved by one or two or even 5 countries. And when we look at the reform of the Security Council, and we obviously have an interest in becoming a permanent member of the Security Council. It's also because we think in different ways, we voice the interests and aspirations of a broad set of countries. We do believe that today the big questions, and I would put especially climate change perhaps right up there. The pandemic has now in the last few years come into focus, but even the pandemic, it revealed to us really how iniquitous and how selfish this world is. I'm not taking a moral position. I'm just looking not at the affordability of vaccines, the accessibility to vaccines, the travel restrictions which came out of that. Now I understand that countries would take whatever precautions they need to take. That is completely understandable. But when you see a set of frankly discriminatory policies, and I think if you travel today especially to Africa, there's a very strong sense of anger about how they were treated during COVID. And today, that sense of frustration that the world is not listening to, I see in respect of issues like food and fuel. That a feeling that their inability to deal with the daily necessities of life is being disregarded by you can say the more powerful or the more established countries of the world. So we have tended to look naturally at Ukraine to some degree as a kind of a east-west issue, if you will. I think there's a north-south aspect to the consequences of the Ukraine conflict as well, and it's very important that the world recognizes that. And I heard this very, very strongly at the United Nations General Assembly. So for us, when you look at a reformed global architecture, we say very clearly, yes, we think India should be in a Reformed Security Council, but we say equally strongly that it's absurd that the entire continent of Africa has been excluded. Latin America has been excluded. So and somewhere the system has to also cater not necessarily for the big guys. I mean, if it has to be, if there's got to be a sort of a larger legitimacy, like we would do in our own politics. I mean, after all, in domestic politics, you don't necessarily cater to the more powerful and leave the rest to God's mercy. I mean, you try and sort of pull as many along with you as possible. So I think there's a larger issue here. Obviously, there's a aspect of fairness and justice, but I would also argue there's a compulsion today of global governance, of good practices, of being able to sensibly address issues. And we are going to get more of these challenges. I mean, you will get typhoons, you will get pandemics, you will get disruptions of various kinds. And I think there will have to be more local or regional solutions to it.
Thank you. Let's turn to the Indo-Pacific. And you've said before, Asia is being shaped by the outlook of the US, power of China, the weight of Russia, the collectivism of ASEAN, the volatility of the Middle East, and the rise of India. Unpack that for me, if you will, and how do we, really New Zealand and India, work together, create better partnerships in the Indo-Pacific? Let me follow that up and give you a little bit more there. You, I think, have been, if I can say so, selective in your partnerships. You're right there in Quad. I think, as you have alluded to, you're not an RCEP, or the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. How do you, according to your interests and values, determine what it is that you will go into?
The problem writing a book is you have other people quote it back. And you don't always remember the thought.
Had a couple of late nights.
You know what drove you to say that. But my recollection of that paragraph, I was really trying to, snappily sum up a very complicated world by saying, well, there are these 7, 8, 9, 10 factors that you need to deal with. Now, in real life, what happens is there's some interplay of all of this, also naturally with our own domestic politics and interests, perhaps some situational layers as well added on to it. And then you take a call on whether, joining this or not joining that is in your interest or not. There's no set formula. It's not that we would say everything global is great or everything in the region is necessarily good or not. Or that we will view suspiciously anything abroad, because, as I said, that's not the mindset in India. So we've taken it, evaluated opportunities and initiatives each on their own merit, and I think where, at least in our own eyes, where we have taken positive decisions, there were good reasons we did so. Where we pull back or we did not take a call, I think there was some prudence there which was justified. So if I were to, address the examples that you mentioned, the Quad for us was a platform whose time finally had come. There was an attempt about 15 years ago to actually do a Quad, and after about a year, it sort of fitted out. And fitted out because the four countries really didn't feel sort of an urgent necessity to make that kind of diplomatic investment in something new. Now, I think this time around, and we did it last time in 2007, this time it was 2017. In those 10 years, I would say, to me, the really big change was the attitude of the United States. The United States has, in that decade, become much more open to working with other countries, much more flexible about that. And that's not a small development, because to be the world's most powerful country, you're used to doing things your way and laying out your terms. So for that to change was quite profound. My sense is in that decade also, India's relations both with Japan and with Australia actually went to a visibly higher level. So all of those contributed to how the Quad came about. And the purpose of Quad is really to work together to see that, in a sense, what are the problems and issues of challenges of the region are addressed in some form by a collective endeavor, because it's no longer possible to do it nationally. On contrast, when it came to the RCEP, we took a decision in 2019 not to proceed with the RCEP, not to join the RCEP. I know that New Zealand made a different decision. And we did it because we weighed the pros and cons. We did a kind of a cost-benefit evaluation and felt that many of our critical issues were not addressed in the final outcome. We went back to the other participants, the other 15 countries, and shared, some of our anxieties with them. But they collectively took the view that they had gone as far as they could. So which is the way sometimes life is. So having weighed it, we decided it was not in our interest, because it would really, in a sense, expose what is still a relatively low-income, small holding economy to risks that we could not justify at all. So I think that was the reason we took the call. It's 3 years since we did it. If you ask me 3 years later, do you feel that was the right call? I think absolutely. I think I would be more confident 3 years later than I was in 2019.
Let's talk New Zealand, India, or India-New Zealand relations, something everyone in this room is vitally interested in. This year we celebrate 70 years of diplomatic relations. Of course, there's many differences. You are big. You're an India to our, I should say, an elephant to our kiwi fruit. But I do think we share some real commonalities. We're rightly, I think, in New Zealand, proud of our, across the political spectrum, independent foreign policy. We do what's right in our interests and values, not Britain's or America's or China's, for that matter. And I know you have, as I understand, a similar doctrine really of strategic autonomy. I think also we're deeply multicultural countries, and we're proud of that. You're right now in the capital of Polynesia, in our view. And as you see here, there is a wonderful contributing Indian diaspora that makes Auckland a great city to be. How do you assess the India-New Zealand relationship 70 years on, and how do you see the future?
Well, it's actually been a very comfortable, very smooth relationship, which was apparently working so well they didn't feel the need for an Indian foreign minister to come.
So what are you doing?
To check out that it's working well. But honestly, my sense is that we are today in an era where distances matter less. The opportunities to work together are far more realistic and practical. The state of the world and of our region is sufficiently unsettled that countries like us need to step forward and do more by ourselves and do more together. Now, I would have a comfort with New Zealand, which I may not necessarily have with all other countries in the Indo-Pacific. So part of the reason I'm here is really also to explore what is it that we can do sort of bigger and better and more impactful. Now, the bilateral part of it, my sense is that we need to look at each other very objectively, but creatively and kind of positively, and say, okay, what are the strengths that we should play to? And then try to build a stronger relationship based on identification of those strengths. To me, the one area of focus would be business. I do think, even though we didn't join the RCEP, and good business, stronger business does not, to my mind, necessarily require an FTA. I mean, we don't have an FTA with our major trade partners. We don't have with the US. We don't have with the EU. We don't have with China, and yet we do business with all of them. To my mind, how can we grow our business collaboration would, for me, rank perhaps as the number one challenge. Second, from New Zealand's perspective of New Zealand's strength, I would say education. You are a kind of a proven education hub, and we too are at an inflection point in our own approach to education. We have a new education, new national education policy, which clearly puts much greater weight on international collaborations, on getting, not just having students go out, but also having students come into India, which I think would be willing to look at a range of options. We are today currently discussing with countries, taking out our own institutions, looking at possibilities of collaboration with foreign universities, perhaps, double degrees. Somewhere in that education space, because increasingly in a sort of knowledge-driven, chip-centered economy that we are all sliding into, education is key to advancement, much more than it has ever been in history. We are in India an increasingly digital society. In fact, the big change of the last 5 to 8 years has been the remarkable pace of the digitization of India. Our ability to vaccinate was, one was to produce the vaccines, but to actually organize, 1 billion people to, in a systematic way, to get your vaccination done was a huge challenge. And we could do it because, in a sense, it was riding on a digital platform. So, how do we look at further digital collaboration? We see climate action as not just a necessity. It has to be built into our lives and into our capabilities and into our working. There too, at a policy level, we may agree, but how do you take that on the ground and actually think of projects and businesses which support that? And then there is that larger security and well-being of the region, you know, and that has so many aspects to it. I mean, just last week, for example, we had our naval commander, the naval chief, come to New Zealand, and we concluded an agreement on white shipping, so that, you know, that's today arrangement we have with a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific, so that we know which are the clean ships and which are not. So there's a lot here, I would say, in terms of regional collaboration, in terms of global issues collaboration, in terms of growing our bilateral businesses. Politically, I think we have absolutely no problems. I mean, we connect, we understand each other. And to some extent, I would also say, and this is from an Indian perspective, you know, we are a big country whose capabilities and interests are growing. It's important for us to understand the world better, and to understand the world, you know, like we do in our personal lives. I mean, if you need to know a new neighborhood, you find a friend in the neighborhood who explains the neighborhood to you. So it's important for us to have friends, so that different regions, I mean, if I were to look, say, at the Pacific Islands, so for us, you know, what are the perspectives of New Zealand would help shape our thinking, and I think would be of great value for us.
Thank you. And I think as I sit here, Minister, those priorities you've outlined for the India-New Zealand relationship will be music to the ears of businesses, and I think the wider New Zealand community. If I think about business and economy and trade, I think what's true is New Zealand has traditionally at least tended to compartmentalise trade across from the other various aspects of the relationship. What I learned in 2019 is that India very much sees things in a wider strategic context, whether it's, as you say, military, cultural, or the economic. You'll be well aware that New Zealand's Trade Minister, Daniel O'Connor's just been to India and met with your counterpart, Minister Goyal, talking to businesses who've come back from that trip, whether it's Esprit, whether it's the Apple and Pear board. You know, they have a real, I think, optimism that actually there's a path here for mutual benefit economically, and that it's sector-led, that potentially us over in your country making capital investments, but also opening up paths to trade. What do you see that could be some, put it this way, quick wins or things that we could do off the bat to get that mutual benefit?
You know, if I were to look for quick wins, honestly, I'd get the business community to look for quick wins, because public policy typically does not lend itself to quick wins. You know, there's too much haggling, there's too long a negotiation. There are so many interests that you bring to bear on the table at the same time, that by its very nature, it's a complicated process. But on the other hand, let's say, if I were to look from the perspective of New Zealand business, I would also evaluate what is changing in India, and whether those are entry points for me to get. You know, I've been here a day, but I, for example, saw someone who's really seen a great window of opportunity in fintech, and has taken that and run with the ball. So there would be, you know, opportunities. I would say in those areas where you're very strong, and I've seen even in the dairy sector where we are organized in a very different way, because it's typically, you know, a small owner collective, cooperative business. But I've seen collaboration with some other countries in that sector, which has a kind of a scale which was attractive as a business proposition. So if you want to do international business, as I learned in the brief period in my biodata, which I sort of between leaving diplomacy and becoming a minister, I did try my hand at business for a year. Try my hand's not the right word. I joined what was the biggest business concern in my country. And I learned that international business has to be very customized. I mean, you have to make an effort. You can intuitively understand your own market because you kind of grow up with it, and so many factors are absorbed by you without even knowing. It's not always easy to do. You can't just extrapolate what you do at home abroad and say, well, that's the way it's going to work. So it's important to study the local circumstances and opportunities. So I would actually suggest that the more interaction we have in the sort of a new opportunities in business, the better it would be for both of us. I think businesses need some guidance and some kind of facilitation.
Minister, you've been incredibly generous with your time. Let me ask you just a couple of final questions. You've been here, you've told us 24 hours, so you are now a country expert. What have you learned about New Zealand and New Zealanders? I'm going to ask you a follow-up. What is it that you think New Zealanders perhaps don't understand about your country that we should?
I'm not that much of an expert. I think it's natural for everybody to use your domestic reference points. It's what we all are. It's only with travel, with exposure, that we change. Now, to my mind, New Zealand has one incredible advantage, which I see in the room, which is the diversity of New Zealand and the openness of New Zealand. If I were to look at some other countries who have used that diversity to full advantage, I mean, one obvious example is the United States. That if India-US relations have changed, and they have, a big part of that is because of the bridging role played by the community. And this is not, there's a lot of self-interest here as well. I mean, in a way, the talents and skills which will come with greater mobility, I would argue, is to the benefit of the New Zealand economy as well. So, one way of developing familiarity with other societies is actually, everybody cannot go and live abroad. I mean, you do that if you're in the foreign service. But others find some other way of getting information and understanding. So the greater the exposure, and to my mind, the bridge that the community can serve as an exposure, I think can really make a big difference. If you ask me what do I think of New Zealand, well, I still remember you beat us in the World Cup. I'm not, that grudge is still held deeply. So we'll have to see what happens in the T20. But look, it's a great country, and I really look forward to spending a few days more.
Dr. Jaishankar, it's been a privilege to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much.